When we look at on and off farm energy use and emissions, and particularly, again, just narrowing in on energy, what we see is that the sources of those emissions are fossil fuel combustion, so for farm equipment, fossil fuel that's used for heating or grain drying, and then emissions that are associated with generating the electricity that is used on farms. So those are the three areas that we're looking at opportunities to reduce. Now, when we then say, okay, about 11% of agricultural emissions come from energy use, then we say, okay, well, let's break that further and get a better understanding of what those relative contributions are from the different ways in which we use energy. And so what that illustrates is that 88% of those emissions come from the combustion of transportation fuels. 76% is from the combustion of diesel, and another 12% from the combustion of gasoline. So really significant chunk coming from those fuels. Electricity, comes in at about 8%, and it's important to note, and as we'll talk about, there's some opportunities to have on-farm renewable energy production, which obviously comes emissions-free. But overall, even if we look at electricity production in Canada, it is trending towards becoming increasingly clean. So there's a mandatory phase out of coal-fired power by 2030. We're seeing less and less investment in natural gas, more and more investment in renewable energy. And then, of course, in many provinces, we also have very significant contribution from hydropower. So in some senses, with electricity, it's already heading in the right direction. Can we accelerate that? Can farms do more to produce their own electricity from renewables? Yes, probably. And that's definitely an important contribution. Similarly, with heating fuel, only comes in at 4%. We'll talk a little bit more, though, about how that has become a bit of a flashpoint. But really, the big emphasis in terms of effort and innovation does need to be on reducing those emissions associated with diesel and gasoline use. So another way to look at that is to think about this from a fuels-based approach. So what are the fuels that are used on a farm, and what are they used for? And then what opportunities do we have to use those fuels much more efficiently, or to actually substitute them out for clean sources of energy, emissions-free energy? And so typically that also requires a change in that piece of equipment, that technology that is consuming that energy. So again, diesel, gasoline, electricity, natural gas, a variety of uses. Electricity has the most diverse ways in which it's used on the farm. And again, fortunately, electricity is, for the most part, already trending in the right direction in Canada. So the other thing I think it's useful to be cognizant of is that we kind of have two parallel pathways, each of which have their pros and cons that ultimately are best assessed at a regional or provincial level, or ultimately even at the level of an individual farm, in terms of what's going to work best for the nature of the operation, the type of equipment used, the age of that equipment. And so on the one hand, we can have the transformation. And that means we're going all the way to zero, or as close to zero emissions as we can. So that means fuel switching to zero carbon sources of energy, really pushing hard on enhanced efficiency. So in terms of that fuel switching, it means using things like biogas and other renewable gases for heat, electrifying as much equipment, vehicles, machinery, irrigation as possible. And with efficiency, again, we can improve the efficiency of lighting. We can improve the efficiency of buildings through better insulation and different heating systems, irrigation. So that's really the transformative opportunity right now, based on the status of different technologies, the cost of energy. That's going to entail higher upfront costs, greater savings in the long term, and ultimately larger greenhouse gas reductions. But this pathway, there probably few farms can make just this wholesale transformative change. And so that means in parallel to that, we're also seeing more of a transition pathway, which means that we're constantly striving for opportunities to have cleaner farming, so with lower emissions. So that can require the more efficient use of fossil fuels. And then, of course, you can also have a blend of these two: transformation where possible, transition where necessary. So as I said, a starting point for my research was the work with Farmers for Climate Solutions. And one of the deliverables that we've produced and that FCS is actively in discussion with folks in Ottawa about is the 2021 budget. And so they put forward recommendations for, I think, what we'd characterize as a down payment on the scale of climate action that's required and that ultimately needs to be factored into the next Canadian Agricultural Partnership, where provinces and the federal government are going to be coming together to really map out what that looks like and what the priorities are. One of the programs that we made budget recommendations on was clean energy. And so there was a $10 million ask spread across a number of different program recommendations. So top priority is to reduce reliance on diesel use. So again, that's about 75% of on-farm energy emissions. So something that we really do need to tackle. Oh, sorry about that. There we are. Okay. So again, here we're going to need that combination of both incremental and transformative efforts. So there's significant opportunities for retrofits of existing equipment. So there are hydrogen internal combustion engine technology retrofits. So that's where you take an existing piece of diesel equipment. There's an add-on to it, that a bolt-on that can both reduce emissions through enhanced efficiency, but can also reduce operating costs. There are a variety of hydrogen-related technologies, or else you can go full-scale vehicle conversion from diesel to compressed biogas. So there are some opportunities to, instead of just going out and buying new equipment, to retrofit existing equipment. And that's important because, particularly for the large pieces of equipment, they've got, a lot of steel, a lot of materials, a lot of plastics in them. And if they're retired early, and then we're going and producing that new equipment, there are quite a few emissions associated with the actual production of this equipment. So it does make sense to get the full life out of this equipment, at least until we reach a point where maybe economically it just doesn't make sense anymore because it would be cheaper to switch to newer technology. But it does make sense in the near term to really say, okay, can we do retrofits that are going to improve the performance, reduce emissions, and hopefully reduce costs at the same time? And then, of course, even our diesel production is going to be getting cleaner. There's a federal regulation called the Clean Fuel Standard that is requiring that on a life cycle basis, liquid fuels that are entering the marketplace in Canada are going to be getting cleaner from a carbon intensity perspective. So some of the recommendations that we've come up in terms of how to do this, and again, so this is now where we talk about more the policy side of things, and I guess one other point to make on the policy is what we've confronted with the federal government is that there really is no one department that we can go to and say, okay, let's clean up farms. That's not a core mandate that Agricultural Canada has. And even then, when we look at how climate policy is being developed and delivered right now, it's scattered across multiple different departments: Transport Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Industry, Science and Economic Development, of course, Agricultural Canada as well, and Environment and Climate Change Canada is driving much of this, but they don't have all of the levers from a regulatory or a program spending perspective to get the job done. And so we've had to make recommendations to numerous different departments that have responsibility for different aspects of this challenge. So one of the recommendations to Transport Canada is to develop a program and to secure budget for it to encourage these diesel retrofits for medium and heavy duty farm vehicles. And there is a precedent here in British Columbia of what they call specialty use vehicles, in which farming equipment is included. So we do have a model in terms of how would you develop and deliver a program like this. You'd have to get a sense of what scale of incentive is required to tip the balance for somebody to say, yes, this is going to make sense for me to shoulder this upfront cost. With the innovation department, they have a strategic innovation fund. Right now, they have a collaborative technology development stream, but right now it's not doing anything related to farms. So to actually create an initiative within that's focused on some of the new technology that still needs to be developed, piloted, and then scaled up to become commercially available. let's look at how we can actually have Canadian companies developing that technology. So make use of that fund. And then similarly with Environment and Climate Change Canada, let's put some budget towards, they have what's called a Low Carbon Economy Challenge Fund, where they basically say, we've got resources available. The challenge is we want to decarbonize X. And so bring us your pilots, your demonstration projects. So what we're recommending is let's have a specific pot of money in that challenge fund saying, what are the best ways, what are the new technologies that we need to test out for zero emission agriculture technologies. And so this would apply to heavy duty farm vehicles, but as I say, it's cross-cutting. It would apply to other opportunities to reduce emissions from energy use as well. Natural Resources Canada, so they're responsible for fuel infrastructure. So if we're talking about adopting hydrogen fuel cell technology, and so we need a supply and infrastructure for distributing hydrogen and having refueling stations, or if we're talking about electric vehicle technology and the charging requirements, let's actually get a better handle on, if we're going to be swapping farm vehicles over to these technologies, what kind of infrastructure requirements do we need? Do we need to do upgrades to the power grid in certain regions to be able to accommodate that? Those are questions that right now we don't have answers to. And there is an existing program, the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that could be tapped to say, okay, let's look specifically at what are those infrastructure needs, because of course, we're not going to get people adopting new technology if they don't have access to the ability to charge it up or fill it up with hydrogen. And then with Transport Canada, they manage the incentive programs for people who want to buy a new electric car. Let's actually, again, have a specific carve out for incentives to help reduce that purchase price for those pieces of farm equipment where there actually is a commercially available zero emission technology on the market today. So second priority is to reduce reliance on gasoline. So this is 12% of emissions. We've got a lot of electric pickups coming to the market. Understanding that it's going to be quite a long time before we're seeing a lot of turnover, not to mention that not all farmers necessarily go out and buy brand new pickup trucks. Nonetheless, the reality is that there is going to be choice in that vehicle segment from numerous different manufacturers. There are going to be 2 hitting the market in 2021 and quite a few others in 2022 and beyond. And so, what we've observed between 1990 and 2014 is that there haven't been appreciable trends in pickup fuel efficiency, in part because as I'm sure many of you have observed, is our pickup trucks are getting bigger. So while vehicle engine technology has been getting more efficient, we're putting in bigger engines. And so we're not actually getting the benefits in terms of reduced gasoline use with them.
Dan, that's 20 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace. So some recommendations here, again, to Natural Resources Canada, to Transport Canada. It's saying, you've got these existing programs and initiatives, let's actually tailor it and create a special allocation looking at how we can encourage uptake of these technologies on farms. The other thing is, particularly where we've got really old, highly polluting vehicles, there's a policy approach called scrappage, which is if you retire that vehicle, if it goes and gets scrapped, you get a check to go and put towards a new electric vehicle. So clean power, and this is what people tend to think about when they're thinking about, oh, I would like to have, rid myself of fossil fuels. So, solar, wind, those types of solutions. Now, again, emissions associated with electricity use on farms are pretty small, about 8% of those total emissions from farms. We have, though, begun to see, particularly Ontario, because of some of the policies that were in place in Ontario with the feed-in tariff, we have begun to see more and more farms that are adopting on-farm renewable energy. It's dominated by solar, second by wind, but a few other technologies as well. So biogas production through anaerobic biodigesters, etc. And so what we see here is that we're beginning to see renewable energy production in many parts of the country. This isn't just isolated to one province or one region, but we have seen higher uptake in Ontario, and that was because of the policies that were in place in Ontario, many of which unfortunately have been removed, but that encourage this uptake of solar. And so here's just one example, a farm in southern Alberta, where two neighbors partnered to build a solar array. They use the electricity to pump water from a lake, and then as power for their central pivot irrigation systems. About 30% of the cost was covered by a provincial grant in Alberta. Again, that grant program is unfortunately not available right now. But what that meant is that the payoff period for that was 8 or 9 years. And of course, that would have been a much longer payback period absent that support from government. So recommendations here, again, you'll notice a theme here, which is we have either had programs in the past that were defunded, or we have programs that really just need to be reoriented to say there's opportunities in this area on farms as well. So let's make sure we're targeting some of those resources to farmers. Number 4, reducing reliance on natural gas. And of course, this has been in the news because it's been a flashpoint as it relates to the federal price on carbon pollution, because unlike gasoline and diesel, which are exempt from the carbon tax, natural gas and propane, which are predominantly used for grain drying, are not. And so that's caused a lot of concern with higher bills for grain drying, which of course, in some areas or in some seasons is going to be a requirement. There's a federal conservative bill that's navigating Parliament right now that would see an exemption for that. But at the same time, what we're seeing is there are some new technologies that have already hit the market that would allow grain drying to occur without using fossil fuels. And one of the reasons why that technology is emerging is because of that innovation signal that the carbon price sends to technology developers to say, hey, there's going to be a market of people who don't want to pay the carbon price, so bring us your technology. So that's actually a signal that having the carbon price on that is working. It's incentivizing the innovation and new technology that, in the case of some of these technologies, not only do they reduce your carbon tax bill, they actually reduce your energy bill overall. And so here's an example that actually just was getting some press yesterday. A new technology that's actually been adapted from similar technology that was used in the mining sector. It uses as fuel sources a variety of waste streams from on the farm. Again, so this offers lower fuel costs, you avoid the carbon tax, and you also reduce emissions. So again, this is something where existing programs, let's try to drive them specifically to application on the farm. And then the last recommendation, and one that's overarching, is that a lot of this stuff is complicated. It can be hard to both understand all of the different ways in which you're using different types of energy, how much you're using, what are the costs of alternatives, what is the emission reduction benefit. And so having clean energy coaches for agriculture, which is a service that is offered to some other sectors, having that offered by Natural Resources Canada would allow farmers to get this customized advice, somebody who's going to help them understand their energy use, the emissions, the different options and opportunities, and to help them navigate some of these different government programs that could serve to help them out. So that's the kind of an overarching recommendation that we've made as well. And that's it. So thanks very much, and look forward to your questions.
Great. Dan, right on time. What a professional program. Thank you very much. Great information, great insights, and great report on the current status of things. And looking forward to chatting with you later. Tony, if I could ask you to start your presentation, please.
Okay, sure. Thank you for having me, setting this all up. Today I'll be speaking about 3 sustainable technologies in relation to agriculture: electric tractors, on-farm solar energy production, and electric delivery vehicles. I'll try to make the case that these technologies are 3 among many both high and low tech that will need to be deployed quickly and on a grand scale to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Moreover, that their rollout ought to be accelerated using state interventionist methods, which then brings us to questions of political economy. And since high tech is all the talk these days and a heavy part of today's discussion, I'd like to make the case that these technologies and almost all modern technologies were largely developed in and supported by the public sector, not just the basic science necessary for their production, but all the way through the innovation and commercialization process, and therefore belong in the public domain. So the fruits of these technologies deserve to be shared in a common way. So in my mind, although there's a lot of talk about it, the problem isn't exactly big data or AI or automation, or even big business, although I realize that big businesses are destructive actors in all this. But in some senses, our monopoly corporations are just rational actors. The problem in my mind is the system of production and exchange that by its own internal laws of motion creates monopolies who then use whatever technologies they have access to extract surpluses. And the accumulation of these surpluses is then done at the expense of really anything that gets in the way: jobs, farmers, indigenous communities, the environment, etc. The solutions to these problems, I believe, lies in both expanding the commons and regulating the market. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the labor struggles of the middle of the 20th century and what was known as the New Deal, at least in the United States. And so updating that for the current predicament, I think we need to be working towards a Green New Deal. And so today I'll be speaking about technology that we have on Wheelbarrow Farm in Uxbridge, but I'd like to conclude with maybe a discussion of some more macro level phenomena that, and for that we have to turn to political economy. So the next slide, I guess. So I run with some business partners and staff, obviously, a 10-acre organic vegetable farm near Uxbridge, Ontario. And yeah, that's an overview of the farm. That's our farm plus a few of the fields that we borrow from neighbors, or we use to grow on from neighbors. So on the next slide, you'll see the Select Track electric tractor that we imported from California 2 years ago. And the next slide has a bit of the specs about it. So it's roughly a 30 horsepower tractor. The motor runs on 48 volts. There's currently in this model no hydraulics or power steering. So I think that's something that needs to be updated. If electric tractors are going to replace diesel tractors, they have to work and be just as good, if not better, in every single capacity. And so the 3-point hitch not being hydraulics, the bucket, mine doesn't have a bucket, but some do, working on electric motors, not as quick and they're not as good as hydraulics. The one that we have has a 6-hour runtime, although if you're using a wagon, which we do a lot, it can last for 12 hours if you're disking or plowing. I haven't plowed, but I do disc with it. And the runtime is much smaller. It's about how much work you're asking from the tractor determines the runtime. And the charge time is about 8 hours. When you lift the hood, it's a very simple design. And this is why I think eventually electric vehicles and electric tractors will just come in as cheaper than diesel, not just cheaper to buy, but cheaper to maintain and cheaper to fuel. It's a simple design with basically just a motor, batteries, a controller, a charger, and a battery management system. Last point is that it's a new technology, and ours was the first iteration of Selectrac's tractor that went onto the market. And with new technologies, I mean, it's almost all the same in every sector. They're more expensive, clunkier than the later iterations. So if you're thinking about buying into a new technology, those are the things you should have your eyes open about. So something quickly about electric motors, and one of the things that I like the most is that you can charge them from sources on your farm. So it was really, it was something pretty amazing to be able to plug it in the first time. I've since gotten used to it, but that was a new thing for me. there's very minimal noise and no exhaust on the farm. The motor has one moving parts, which is much different than internal combustion. And the batteries I'd like to speak about a little bit. Currently, lithium ion batteries are sort of like the limiting factor. They're expensive relative to what they will be in the future, and they represent, I think, the biggest cost of electric vehicles and electric tractors. So this is just a visual representation, and this is what I mean by batteries are the limiting factor, and it's owing to their relatively low energy density compared to hydrocarbons. So you can see in this representation, with current battery technology, you need about 30 times more battery space by volume than you do of diesel fuel, for example, to get the same amount of work done. However, as battery technology improves and prices fall, larger and larger applications will be possible. So right now we're starting with small tractors. In the electric vehicle field, it started with very small cars and sedans, but very quickly they're working their way up. And as battery technology advances, the larger applications will be possible. This is just a graph which shows the development of lithium over the years. The blue line represents, let's see here, the falling cost per unit, and the red line represents energy density. So they're getting more energy dense and costing less and less. And so I think that those trend lines will continue into the future, including, I think we'll eventually reach, they're all working on it, a solid state battery, which would be the next generation of battery. So in here, I just wanted to touch on second-gen biofuels. My main issue with internal combustion engines is the energy source and its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Having said that, in the first presentation touched on this, there are millions of tractors out there, and it's not realistic just to, retire them and switch them out for electric tractors. The same goes for heavy machinery and airplanes. So this is where the idea of fuel switching technologies comes in, and it was mentioned hydrogen as a possibility, but second-gen biofuels, and I'm not talking about ethanol here, there are now starting to come onto the market, or just in the commercialization phases, biofuels that are net carbon zero, and they're drop-in. Like, you can drop them into a tank of an internal combustion engine and they work in the same way. So there's an American company right now working on building facilities for this, and they're working with farmers growing no-till corn. They extract the sugar and ferment it into an isobutanol, and from there convert it into either jet fuel or diesel. So this is one of the thousands of ways that we'll be able to draw down greenhouse gas emissions. So when we decided to import the tractor and to put in solar panels, we were looking for funding, and we took out actually loans from friends and customers in the forms of what we called community bonds. We let our customers know what we were up to and the costs, and we were able to raise the necessary funds to pay for it. And we're about two years away from paying those loans off. It's one option if you don't have access to traditional forms of funding. But this is an example of what I would call gaming the system rather than changing the system. And it's well within the realm of possibility for the government to offer zero interest loans for this type of purchase, or even grants or cost sharing options. So if there's zero interest fiat currency available for banks and large financial organizations, it could also be available for farmers if the will was there. And if there are subsidies for the purchase of Teslas, if they can cost share with them, then they can cost share with farmers too for the purchase of electric vehicles or electric tractors. So if you've been reading the NFU's reports over the last few years, you'll know that farmers in Canada are increasingly indebted and have falling net farm incomes. So under these circumstances, it doesn't make sense to me to place the burden on farmers to fund this transition themselves. The government should fund and incentivize the transition through a variety of mechanisms at their disposal. So this picture is on the screen is our 10 kilowatt solar array we installed 2 years ago, and it produces enough energy to power the farm in its entirety in the 6 sunniest months of the year, and to offset our bill some in the other 6 months. So some facts about solar energy. The sun gives us about 10,000 times the energy we need. It's something like a mature technology, meaning that there's an ecosystem of people who build the component parts and can work on them, companies that you can go to get installed, which is a little different from electric tractors, which is a very, very new technology. And as of 2017, not everywhere, but in some places in the world, solar became the cheapest energy ever produced. It's growing exponentially, and for our array, it's about an 8-year return on investment. And this is with we just missed the incentive program. So that investment could be brought way down if there were, once again, cost share options available. In the previous slide to this is just showing the cost exponential price drop of solar panels, and price is here, it's called the Swanson effect. It's an inverse function of how many were produced. So near when I was born, a watt of solar energy cost almost $80, and now it costs under 30 cents today. So very few things have dropped like that, and the trend lines there are pretty obvious. This next slide is a historical representation of the cost of mostly fossil fuels per energy unit. And then that gray line that seems to be like dropping from outer space is solar electricity. So this is just showing what possibilities are coming, and they're starting to displace fossil fuels, not because of environmental issues per se, just because they're starting to be cheaper. So one thing I actually didn't expect or realize when we installed the solar is that it would make me think differently about different projects we had on the farm. So this is our new Seedling Greenhouse, and this is from a couple of weeks ago. We now have plants in there. And so we're trying to use as much solar electricity as we can to heat the greenhouses at night. And right now we're just doing tests, seeing what the outside temperature is. And so under this table, there's a series of 9 1.5 kilowatt electric rads, and then the hoops on that table over that is another piece of plastic that we put at night. And so we're basically just creating a greenhouse within a greenhouse, but it will be interesting to see. Now, of course, in the last 2 weeks, it's been really warm. Usually we have negative temperatures at night, but over this year, we're gonna see, could we run our same operation without using any propane to heat the greenhouse? And usually we spend about $1,000 a year on propane. And the next project I'd like to do, if not this year, then the following year, that's our irrigation pond. And we use a Honda trash pump to irrigate the fields, but could we set up an electric pump house? And so it really has changed my mind about, or is brought in my mind about what is possible. Once you start producing your own electricity, then you start looking for different things on the farm. How can you get rid of your traditional fossil fuel use and start using electricity? So the last technology I want to consider is electric delivery vehicles. And for us, really, although we've done the other two already, this is the one that's going to make the biggest impact for our business, not just for greenhouse gas emissions, but also for our financial bottom line. It's a much bigger fuel demand for us. We do, well, COVID has changed this a bit, but several years ago, we were doing 6 Toronto markets, a CSA, wholesale delivery. So the van was on the road basically every single day of the week. And I really do look forward to, within the next couple of years, of never going to the gas station again, and instead using on-farm electricity production. It won't just decrease our greenhouse gas emissions, but it will save us about $7,000 a year, which that's $7,000 goes straight to the net side of our income. There are, of course, many other on-farm applications for electric. One of them is utility vehicles. We do have an electric ATV that we use on the farm with a little wagon behind it, just for getting around and for some small harvests. Post-harvest handling, whether this is electric forklifts or pallet trucks if you have a bigger operation in a warehouse. Portable power tools. I really enjoy my electric chainsaw. And there's a guy at Reed Alloway at Turnasol Farm who's kind of like a DIY guru on this, and so you can maybe find him online through social media. It's at Turnasol Farm, and he has a whole bunch of applications that he's trying to do with batteries and electric. And of course, autonomous and robotic applications as well. So that's basically the discussion of what we're doing on the farm. And with the time remaining, I'd like to address some of the macro level phenomena and their interplay with the climate crisis and sustainable technology. So current farm methods are responsible for a large percentage of greenhouse gas emissions. The big three are transportation, energy production, and agriculture. So the crisis can't be solved by ignoring one of them, and so agriculture will have to be one of them. It's also the case that our ability to grow food will be negatively affected by those emissions as temperatures rise. So it's been estimated that for every 1 degree temperature increase, food production will drop from 5 to 10% due to droughts and extreme weather patterns associated with climate change. And as farmers, we're in a unique position to do something about it simply because we manage so much land. However, owing to the ownership structure of our society, the financial state of farmers that farmers find themselves in, which is a food system dominated by several large near monopoly corporations, there's very little hope that farmers will be able to make this transition on our own. And the next slide shows this graph from an NFU report. The portion of income, and I think this is over, yes, from 1926 to, I can't see it, but it's about 100 years of farm income. The portion that goes to farmers is in green, and the portion that goes to input companies, fertilizers and seed inputs, the banks, tractor manufacturers, et cetera, is in blue. And the trend lines here are also clear and also not good. And especially since the 1980s and the neoliberal turn ushered in by Reagan and Thatcher, farmers are just scraping by. And on this graph, there's even some years where farmers' net income was negative. So, I mean, let that sink in for a second. If in that year, it looks like $40 billion in agricultural sales and net farm incomes were negative. The next slide, I think, shows just farm debt load. So over the same time period, farm debt levels have exploded, and much of this debt is used to finance the transition to high input, high output forms of production that are responsible for a large portion of greenhouse emissions. So if Canadian farms are heavily indebted and net farm incomes are painfully low, are farmers really in the position to make the bold moves necessary to transition our food economy? Big agribusiness, like all corporations, are primarily focused on capital accumulation and are the main drivers of our unsustainable system. So we shouldn't look to them either. And I think that only leaves an interaction between the agricultural sector and state level intervention as a viable alternative. And there's an historical precedent for this in the middle of the 20th century. In the United States, at least, this was called the New Deal. And so this is what I was speaking about earlier, the need for a Green New Deal. Now, there isn't one right now, and people are talking about what it could involve. Here are some of many of the things that it could involve, but zero interest financing for sustainable tech and or grants or cost share for the same thing. Paying farmers to capture carbon. If farmers' incomes are low and we need to capture carbon, there are many ways to do this, but that's one of the options. Agricultural extension officers who can help farmers navigate both government programs and sustainable tech options. And could go through all of these: a universal basic income, ending or limiting intellectual property rights on seeds, especially since almost all of the work was done on the public dime to begin with, and higher taxes on extreme concentrations of wealth and land, and using that money for these ends.
That's 20 minutes, Tony.
Okay, yeah, I'm just about done. Thank you.
Great.
Universities becoming living laboratories. Now, I know students want tuition-free university, and actually I support that. And employers want graduates who are ready for the workforce. So one option is to have university students, as part of their degree, working, rather than writing papers about this or that, actually part of their degree is working on the actual transition and interacting with public and private sector actors. A few other things, I just wrote these down very quickly, but support for unions and co-ops, and federal jobs guarantee with a focus on sustainability. And I think there's maybe a state in Germany who's doing this. You're unemployed, okay, here's the training course, and then here's the job. And they both have a focus on green projects and sustainability. This graph is from actually an economist, Thomas Piketty, in his book Capital in the 21st Century, and shows how transformative the original New Deal was. The timeline at the bottom runs from 1918 to 2011. What the red line shows the level of trade union membership, and trade unions were something that were encouraged by the New Deal. And what the blue line shows is income inequality. So that is what percentage of wealth is owned by the top 1%. And this is, in my opinion, one of the best graphs depicting what happened in the 20th century. And is there a next slide? I'm not sure. Okay, just really quickly. If you take a look at the innovation cycle, technologies are developed through public funding, universities, national labs, and private sector grants and incentives. So in this way, we socialize all of the risks, all the hard work, and then we privatize the rewards. With example of computer or IT technology, it took millions of people, thousands of institutions, and decades of time to develop the computers we have today, all on the public dime. And a few years later, our internet and computer landscape are basically owned by 5 billionaires. So there's the economist Mariana Mazzucato, and her work is a good place to start on this, on the role of innovation and how it's really publicly driven. And she does a good job at debunking public versus private sector myths. Few last points. One, we live basically in a massive contradiction. On the one hand, everything's possible. We can go to Mars, edit our genes, drive hoverboards or whatever. But on the other hand, all these things that our grandparents' generations were able to do are deemed not possible, like a federal jobs guarantee, affordable housing, nationalization of natural resources, and taxing the corporations and distributing that wealth downwards through the process of rolling out large-scale public infrastructure projects. With regards to modern technology, there are two basic camps one is the sort of doom and gloom techno-pessimism inspired by Black Mirror, common among environmentalists and progressives. And on the other hand, it's the sort of Silicon Valley techno-utopians who think that the right technology and a good TED Talk is going to solve things. And I would prefer a third option, which is bringing these technologies into the public domain and ensuring that their benefits are made common. And it's a big task, but we could go a long way to completing some of that task under the banner of a Green New Deal. Last point, with COVID, not to mention the climate crisis, I think there's a really good opportunity for it. Since 2008 and the financial collapse, I think cracks have formed in the sort of free market ideological hegemony. COVID has broken those cracks wide open, at least for the time being. And so it's no longer taken seriously, this idea that the unfettered free market can produce the great good for the greatest number of people. So taking lessons from the labor struggles of the original New Deal, this task wasn't accomplished by individuals. It was individuals who belonged to organizations, organizations who formed coalitions, and coalitions who fought for clearly defined policy outcomes. One of those policy outcomes should be lessening the climate impact of Canadian agriculture, while at the same time providing good, secure employment and income for farmers and people living rurally. And so I think I'm probably maxed out my time, but that's about it.